Remember the other day when I told you to look around and look and find objects that were especially important to you during this time? Well, now I want you to think, what objects around you have you taken for granted? Maybe you didn't think of how important they were until now. I'll give you an example for me. For me, it's my stove. Now, because I was out all the time eating breakfast and lunch at work, and then sometimes going out with friends to dinner at night, I hardly ever cooked, so I didn't think about my stove too much. And now that I'm in quarantine, I'm stuck and I'm having to cook food here at home. However, there's a problem. The gas in my apartment building is off, and I don't have a stove to cook with. Now, something that seems so silly for me is really important now. I've definitely taken my stove for granted because when I had it and it worked, I didn't use it as much. But now that I need it really badly, I don't have access to it. Right now, take a moment and think, what are some things around you that you've taken for granted? Maybe you didn't appreciate how important these objects around you were. Join me as I show you what your entry can look like inside your journals. All right, writers, this is how we're going to do our journal writing today. About which objects around us have we taken for granted? Now, when we talk about what have we taken for granted, we mean what are things that we didn't really value before, and now we understand how important they are for us. Have you ever seen the movie The Brave Little Toaster? This is a movie about objects that were left behind when their owner moved. There was a toaster, a lamp, a blanket, a radio, and a vacuum. These objects were taken for granted because the person who had them didn't really value them for what they were. Today I want to teach you this, that journal writers often pause to notice the objects around them. Sometimes they ask, what objects have I taken for granted? Now, earlier I gave you the example of my stove, so let me show you what that looks like in my journal entry. Stoves. Stoves are important, right? I mean, I should have always known that, but in my case, I didn't. I hardly would ever use my stove. I would get Dunkin' in the morning for breakfast. For lunch, Vilma would always sneak me a yummy school lunch. And for dinner, I would usually eat out with my friends. So I never really used my stove. I did not have a reason to. But now, I can't eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner at all of those places. I need to eat at home. Another problem. My apartment has no gas. Just before quarantine, the gas in my building was turned off. Now I can't cook at home. I never realized how important my stove was. I find that I am upset so many times in the day because I do not have a working stove. I use other things, a slow cooker, an Instapot, a hot plate, but I realized that some things would be easier if I just had a working stove. I took this object for granted. I knew that in the future, when I was having a working stove and gas, that I will be much more grateful for it. It's true what they say. You never know how important something is until you lose it. I hope I never lose my stove again. All right, writers, do you notice how I'm writing about an object that I took for granted? An object that I didn't realize how important it was until it was too late? I also grew out my ideas, explaining my thoughts, and using ways to push my thinking. Make sure your journal entries are more than 1 or 2 sentences long. Now, take a moment and think about the objects around you. What objects do you notice that you have taken for granted? Why is this object so important to you now? Do you think that you will recognize the object's importance in the future? What object are you going to be writing about today? All right, writers, off you go. I'm excited to see what you produce.